German illustrator Hermann Vogel was born in the city of Plauen in the Kingdom of Saxony in 1854, the son of a master builder. In his late teens, Hermann originally set out to study law, but quickly realised his mistake and left to study art at the Dresden Academy, but only between 1874 and 75. In 1877 he travelled to Italy, and when his father died in 1878, Vogel moved into the family house in Plauen and not much later started work as a professional illustrator. Dates are frustratingly erratic when it comes to Vogel's publications, but it was around 1880 that he set about creating a large volume of historical images for books, quite a few of which were Germanically themed. All these dramatic illustrations were created by Vogel in pen and ink, but were then painstakingly engraved into wood by others for reproduction. And although the process gave his illustrations a certain formal rigidity in their actual execution, there was no denying the energetic structure and posing of figures in many of the more combat-themed examples. In order to enable a comparison, I got very lucky in my searches when I found this rare example of an original illustration for the series, created in pen, ink and graphite. I've been unable to find out the title, author or publisher, but can only suppose they were intended as serious visual records of documented moments in ancient history. And they were considered educationally valuable enough to be reprinted for quite a few years to come in other historical volumes published throughout Europe and in Britain well into the following century. In 1883, Vogel's work appeared in colour for the first time. His illustrated edition of Dangers of the Wild, a German translation of the 1837 novel Nick of the Woods by American author Robert Montgomery Bird, featured a chromolithographically printed colour cover and several other full-page illustrations dotted throughout the book. This early method of reproduction would within a couple of decades be superseded by full-colour offset lithography, the process still in use today, but at the time these images would have been considered a rare marvel. And in the same year he created 6 similar coloured images for another book, The Norwegian Tale of a Fragger, but unfortunately all I could track down in this case was the cover and frontispiece to show. 2 years later, in 1885, his illustrations began to appear on the cover and in the pages of the illustrated family newspaper Die Gartenlaube, which translates as the gazebo. Like his historical illustrations, all the images he created for this publication were engraved from his drawn originals, but whoever was doing the engraving for the magazine was a considerably more sophisticated master of the craft. It's a guess on my part, but they may have been engraved in zinc or copper, either of which were capable of finer detail than wood. It was with the work for Die Gartenlaube that he began creating generally sentimental and romantic evocations of an idealised Germanic woodland world, blending real and fantasy characters. Some of these images were manifestly created at least partially from observation. The rural scenery in particular had the authority we would expect from studies and sketches at least, and it was with this kind of work that in the main he forged the rest of his career. In 1887, Vogel relocated to Loschwitz, just outside Dresden. And in 1888 he created a series of highly decorative and visually engrossing chromolithographic colour compositions on the theme of various wine-growing regions from a range of different European countries. I confess I have no idea what purpose they may have served, although I'm certain they would not have been posters. But whatever their promotional function may have been, they were without exception skillfully and attractively drawn and reproduced. It was also in that year that he created this charming humorous Easter image of a rabbit emerging from an egg, probably for Die Gartenlaube, which was subsequently and somewhat oddly used as a trademark for the Valent Heating Company, and is still in use in a much modernised, virtually unrecognisable form. It was also around the same time that he began creating more folklore and woodland fantasy-themed illustrations for the German humour magazine Fliegende Blätter. Like Die Gartenlaube, the images he created for Fliegende invariably depicted and exploited traditional ideas of a bucolic enchanted Germany, and no doubt appealed to readers as being in reassuring opposition to the increased industrialisation taking place throughout Europe at the time. Many were romantic and even heroic, but others were more overtly comical, and he proved to be equally adept with all manner of approaches to his figure work accordingly. Although again there are conflicting years of publication on offer, 1890 seems to be the best guess for the publication of the book German Heroic Legends, written by Gustav Schalk. This was a major commission for Vogel, and obviously a perfect fit for his own desire to visualise such subject matter. Unsurprisingly, he more than rose to the occasion with the production of a range of complex, suitably dynamic and highly evocative compositions inspired by these tales of Bavarian heroism, which were guaranteed to keep the reader absorbed and their imagination stimulated. By this point, thanks to the success he had enjoyed in his career so far, he had already become quite wealthy, and in 1891 Vogel had a magnificently eccentric fairy tale house built in the wooded rural region of Krebs, about 10 miles from Plauen, which he used as a second home. In the following year, Vogel's illustrations for Gustav Schalk's rousing legend The Ring of the Nibelung were published to great acclaim and popular success. And as with the German legends, this was the kind of narrative fantasy that was second nature to him, and once more this is clearly reflected in the results. All the dramatic and romantic illustrations he created for this volume were transcribed by the respected engraving house owned by Richard Brenda Moore, who despite his French-sounding name was actually German, and the printed outcomes were probably as faithful a transcription of Vogel's original drawings as could be produced by this method. But however ideal this commission had been for Vogel, it's possible that his version of the Grimm's Household Tales in 1894 was an even better fit. This immense undertaking produced a particularly large volume of fascinating monochrome full-page and spot illustrations and chapter headings, which were arranged sympathetically with the narratives. And it's little wonder that he had been at work on this project for the best part of 3 years, such was the scale of the work involved. And of course all these images had to be engraved, a process which took considerably longer than the creation of the originals. In addition to the engraved monochromes, the book also contained a dozen or so full-page chromolithographic colour images. And despite the rather approximate nature of this early colour print process, they were generally of a high standard for the time. How much control Vogel had over their reproduction and what his originals had looked like I don't know, as none still exist. But they were extremely engrossing demonstrations of his enviable skills as a creator of plausible scenery and characters of all kinds. And they captured the Grimm's narratives with great success. In addition to this massive undertaking, his association with Fliegende Blätter continued undiminished, and there was no letting up in his creation of humorous and romantic evocations of a mythical Germany, which it seems the readers couldn't get enough of. He was also one of a number of his contemporaries chosen to create monochrome and colour images for the highly popular series Münchener Bilderbogen, a collection of single-sheet prints. They were published by the Munich-based company Braun and Schneider, who were also responsible for Fliegende Blätter, and among the images Vogel produced was this highly entertaining and visually complex fantasy procession. This epic engrossing image was undoubtedly one of his most significant and enduring creative triumphs, and I split the 3 sections of the sequence in order to give a clearer indication of just how much creative energy and graphic skill went into the production of the total. By this point in his career, the publishers Braun and Schneider were his only client, but they more than kept him occupied with the creation of illustrations for Fliegende Blätter alone. It's recorded that Vogel was living in Dresden, which is around 280 miles distant from Munich, so the only way the relationship could have worked is by long distance, with Vogel sending originals by mail for Braun and Schneider's engravers to transcribe for print. Even so, this can't have been ideal for Fliegende Blätter, which was a weekly publication, so there were very short turnaround times for this to be done. Mysteriously following the publication of his Bilderbogen illustrations, the evidence is overwhelming that from this point on he remained a purely monochrome illustrator, with one solitary example I found from a few years later, which will be revealed soon. But even without benefit of colour printing, the enduring and widespread popularity of his more robust, good-natured woodland fantasy images led inevitably to albums of his collected work published in 1896 and 1899. By the beginning of the 20th century, Fliegende Blätter had at least bowed to the inevitable march of technological progress and started to reproduce its visual content using lithography. Consequently, Vogel's work and that of his colleagues at the magazine took on a far more obviously textural and less formal stylistic appearance, and the originals were no longer at the mercy of the engravers for better or worse. Some of the originals were produced using just pen and ink and created as line only, with some skillfully and unobtrusively rendered hatching for texture and to create visual balance. But others made use of other mediums with the addition of black chalk, pencil, painted tones and opaque white highlighting. Whatever he used in their creation, they were uniformly engrossing and aesthetically pleasing. In 1905, Braun and Schneider published another volume of children's stories, this time written by the particularly obscure J.J. Rudolphi, and the large volume of charming and occasionally amusing page illustrations Vogel produced for the book were all created as pen and ink monochrome vignettes, which were dotted about the text, with several devoted to each of the narratives contained. Other than these, there was just one colour example for the frontispiece, which might just be the only example of his work printed by full-colour offset lithography. In 1909 he took a job as a professor at an unknown art school, but his academic position didn't seem to interfere with his own output, and he continued to appear with great regularity in Fliegende Blätter. And although it would be fair to describe him as being typecast, presumably happy, as a warm-hearted traditional fantasy illustrator, it seemed he was able to keep making these images with enough variety to keep his readership more than happy. And they provided the strongest evidence, if it was needed, that he continued to be just as evocative, expressive and imaginative as he had always been. In 1914, France declared war on Germany, and he set about creating a series of patriotic illustrations which incorporated Germanic mythology and long-standing notions of Aryan heroism as metaphors and themes. But unlike other satirical magazines such as Simplicissimus, Vogel and his colleagues generally refrained from the creation of overtly negative images of the enemy or their leaders, and with only a couple of exceptions largely confined themselves throughout the conflict to the task of boosting the morale of the civilian population. Vogel completely avoided direct reference to the carnage that was taking place, and in some cases warlike or even patriotic themes were absent altogether. Once the war had ended, he continued to appear in Fliegende and returned immediately and exclusively to more blameless and frivolous subject matter, and his beloved elves and gnomes were even more than usually in evidence in his work. And he was still working for the magazine up to 1921, the year he died at the age of 67 at his fairy tale house in Krebs. As much as I greatly admire Vogel's skill with pen and ink, I can't help thinking it's a pity he stuck with the resolutely monochrome, in his lifetime at least, Fliegende Blätter. The magazine's two major rivals, Meggendorfer Blätter and Lustige Blätter, were both regularly featuring colour images from the early 20th century onwards, and it would have been a particular treat to see at least some of his later work from the magazine printed by offset colour lithography. But I'll take a glass half full rather than half empty outlook on this, and despite my moaning, I'm intensely grateful that we have so much of his work still to admire. And as is usually the case, I'll end my own tribute to this immensely talented and fascinating illustrator with just a few more examples for your entertainment and education.